Have you ever felt like you're the only one out of place in a happy crowd? It's like you're standing outside a party watching everyone dance and laugh, but you can't bring yourself to step inside. That's exactly how David felt, a successful and wealthy man, yet trapped by his own loneliness. Until one day, a 5-year-old girl in a blue dress changed everything with just one sentence. "Your chair is so cool." The crystal light from the colossal chandelier fell like a golden rain shimmering on the ebony dance floor and the silk evening gowns. In the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, New York City, the smooth melody of a live jazz band wove through the air, mingling with peals of laughter and lively conversation. This was a night of joy, of embraces, of dances, and most of all, of love. But for David Ole, it was just a vivid painting that he stood outside of forever, unable to step inside. He sat alone at table 12, tucked away in a corner of the room, a perfect spot to observe without drawing too much attention. David had deliberately chosen this corner. This location gave him a panoramic view of the wedding of Jake, his partner, and also his best friend. But it was also a safe haven, a small fortress to hide from the pitying eyes of the 300 guests. David Ole was no stranger to attention. At 32, he was one of the youngest and most successful CEOs in the medical technology field. He possessed immense wealth, penthouse apartments in major cities, and a business empire that was growing at a dizzying pace. But all of that seemed to become meaningless since that fateful night 5 years ago. His perfectly tailored navy blue Armani suit hugged his broad shoulders and strong physique, but all that perfection ended at his waist. The quickie wheelchair with its sleek black carbon fiber frame was the centerpiece, an unyielding reminder of what he had lost. He took a sip of champagne, its cool fizz unable to quench the burning sensation in his chest. He watched couples lost in a slow dance. They moved in perfect sync, light and natural, as if they were born to be one. David remembered his first dance with Charlotte, his former fiancée, in a small jazz club in Greenwich Village. He had once been a talented dancer, full of energy and freedom. Now those legs were only a memory, a silent pain he kept buried. He observed children playing between the tables, their red and blue dresses creating vibrant streaks of color on the marble floor. He remembered as a child he had dreamed of a large family with kids running all over the yard. Those dreams had died with his legs crushed under 2 tons of steel when a drunk driver sped through the intersection of 5th Avenue and Broadway, sweeping everything away in one horrific moment. 5 years had passed. 5 years of struggling with physical therapy, with anger, with frustration. 5 years to learn to face the truth that his life would never be the same. And also 5 years to learn to live with the pity of others. He always wondered when was the last time someone truly looked into his eyes, not down at the wheelchair, not with a look of pity, but truly looked at him, David Ole, a complete human being. "Hey, David, glad you could make it," Jake, his partner, had said. Jake's voice carried that distinct tone people use when they feel sorry for someone, a tone David was all too familiar with. The ceremony was beautiful, wasn't it? Marie looked stunning in her wedding dress. David nodded and offered his congratulations, but Jake had already hurried to another table before he could finish his sentence. That was how most conversations went. People felt obligated to acknowledge his presence, but they never stayed long enough for a real conversation. Despite his loneliness, David was still an extraordinary man. Since the accident, his company had grown by 40%. Part of it was because work was the only thing that made him feel useful, feel alive. It was always the next deal, the next acquisition, the next multi-million-dollar decision. But that success felt hollow. He had enough money to buy anything he wanted, houses in every city, cars he couldn't drive, vacations he took alone. His penthouse overlooked the entire city, but most nights he just sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, feeling as though he were looking at life from the outside. His face pressed against the glass, yet never able to step through. A loud burst of laughter from a nearby table pulled David from his thoughts. A group of couples in their 30s were sharing funny stories about their weddings and honeymoons. A woman in a vibrant green dress gesticulated wildly as she recounted a wedding day disaster involving a runaway flower girl and a chocolate fountain. Her husband pulled her close and kissed her on the temple while the others roared with laughter. A pang of pain twisted in David's chest. He had been engaged once. Charlotte had stayed with him through the initial recovery, through the physical therapy sessions, the anger and the depression. But after 8 months of hospital visits, medical equipment, and the harsh reality that their future would not be as planned, she had quietly returned the engagement ring and moved to another city. He couldn't blame her. The life they had dreamed of had died with his legs. The band started another slow song. David watched more couples take to the dance floor. A young father lifted his little daughter, her tiny hands clinging to him, and they danced together. An old man led his wife, who had likely been with him for 50 years, moving slowly in a gentle circle, her silver dress shimmering under the lights. Even Jake's teenage nephew worked up the courage to ask a girl in a bright yellow dress to dance, and they swayed awkwardly but happily at the edge of the floor. David's phone buzzed, a text message from his assistant reminding him of a board meeting on Monday morning. Always work, always the next deal, the next acquisition, the next multi-million-dollar decision. Brilliant yet hollow. David had everything but no one to share it with. He wondered if he was the only man in the world who felt so alone in a party of 300 people. His loneliness was so vast it seemed to fill the entire space. He wanted to leave, but his motionless legs couldn't act on his desire. This wheelchair provided freedom, but it was also an invisible cage. He wanted to stand up to escape the pity, the stares, but he couldn't. He could only sit here and watch. He closed his eyes. He had heard stories of people finding happiness in the most unexpected moments, but for him it seemed all opportunities had closed after the accident. He had given up hope of finding someone who could see the real him, someone who could see David, not David in a wheelchair, someone who could see him as a man, not as a disabled person. Amidst the hundreds of people here, he felt like a dead star, still shining but having no life left. In that silent moment, he almost didn't hear the voice beside him. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was warm and gentle with a slight hesitation. David slowly opened his eyes. He was so used to being ignored that when someone spoke to him, he could barely believe his ears. He looked up. Before him stood a woman next to his table. Her dark brown hair was neatly tied in a bun, and those chocolate-colored eyes were looking straight at him without avoidance. And beside her, a little girl in a vibrant blue dress was looking at him with curious, non-judgmental eyes. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was not a pitying whisper, nor was it an awkward acknowledgement. It was soft and warm with a touch of charming hesitation. David looked up, his eyes long accustomed to staring into nothingness, expecting nothing. But now he was faced with a sight he hadn't encountered in years. A woman whose eyes looked straight at him, never glancing down at the wheelchair, never turning away. She was genuinely beautiful. Her olive skin seemed to glow under the soft light of the ballroom. Her natural hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, revealing the delicate lines of her face. She wore a deep red dress that hugged her curves perfectly, and silver high heels made her about 5'6". Her appearance exuded confidence, yet her eyes held a certain softness, a hint of vulnerability deep within. Beside her was a little girl, maybe 5 years old. She wore a blue dress with white flowers, her hair neatly braided with matching ribbons. Niece stood there looking at David with that pure curiosity only a child possesses. Her large brown eyes took in everything about David, from his elegant suit to the complex wheelchair, without a hint of judgment. She didn't see a man who was hurt. She saw something new, something interesting to explore. Yes, David tried to speak, but his voice was drier and more hoarse than he had expected. He cleared his throat. The woman's smile brightened, and David felt something in his chest suddenly shift. How long had it been since he had received a smile like that? A genuine smile, as if she were truly happy to see him. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice carrying a gentle southern lilt. "I'm Heaven Johnson, and this is my daughter, Niece. We don't really know anyone here except the bride who I work with at the hospital. I was just wondering." She paused, took a deep breath, and looked him directly in the eyes. "Would you mind being my date tonight?" David blinked, certain he had heard wrong. "I'm sorry, what?" A light blush touched Heaven's cheeks, but her smile didn't fade. "I know it sounds odd, but Niece and I have been sitting alone all night. Everyone else seems to be with a partner or in a group, and I noticed you looked a little by yourself as well. I thought maybe we could keep each other company." Niece tugged at her mother's dress. "Mommy, can we sit with him? He has the coolest chair I've ever seen." David felt a lump form in his throat. The coolest chair she'd ever seen. Not the saddest thing, not something to whisper about or avoid, just a cool chair. Niece didn't see the wheelchair. She saw a piece of interesting technology. "Niece," Heaven said softly, "what have we talked about using our inside voice?" But David was already smiling. It was his first real smile in months. He looked down at Niece. "It is a pretty cool chair," he agreed. "It goes really fast, and I can spin around in it too." Niece's eyes went wide. "Can you show me?" "Niece," Heaven warned, but David raised a hand. "It's all right," he said, then looked up at Heaven. "And yes, I would be honored to be your date tonight. I'm David Ole." At David's reply, Heaven felt her heart flutter. She had been watching him from a distance for an hour. As a nurse, she had worked with many patients in wheelchairs, and she recognized the look of someone who felt invisible. Although he was not her patient, she had felt a strong urge to do something. She was tired of seeing lonely people. "Are you sure?" David asked, gesturing to the empty seats at his table. "I have to warn you, I'm not exactly the life of the party." "Neither am I," Heaven admitted, letting out a soft laugh. "Niece and I were just sitting there making up stories about the other guests because we had no one to talk to." Niece was studying David's wheelchair with fascination. "How fast does it go?" she asked abruptly. "Niece," Heaven said, feeling her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "What did we say about asking personal questions?" But David's face lit up with amusement. "It can go pretty fast," he told Niece. "Seriously, definitely faster than you can run." "No way," Niece said, crossing her little arms. "I'm super fast. My mom says I'm like a cheetah." "A cheetah, huh?" David grinned. "Impressive. But this chair has a motor." Niece's mouth formed a perfect O of amazement. "A motor like a car." "Just like a car," David agreed. "Want to see?" He pressed a button on the armrest and moved a few feet away, then spun around in a perfect circle. Niece clapped and giggled. Heaven felt a warmth spread through her chest. Most adults either ignored Niece completely or talked to her as if she were much younger than 5. But David spoke to her daughter like a real person, taking her questions seriously and answering them with patience and humor. "That's so awesome," Niece declared. Can I try?" "Niece, you can't get in someone else's wheelchair," Heaven said quickly. Actually, David said thoughtfully, if your mom allows it, you could sit on my lap and help me drive it around the table, but only if your mom says yes. Heaven hesitated. She was fiercely protective of niece, perhaps overly so. As a single mother, she was always cautious about strangers and their intentions. But there was something about David that felt different. Please, Mommy, niece begged, bouncing on her toes. I promise I'll be super careful. Okay, Heaven finally said, but just one trip around the table and you have to do exactly what David says. Just David, he corrected softly. Mr. David makes me feel old. Niece practically vibrated with excitement as David adjusted the chair so she could safely climb onto his lap. He showed her where to put her hands on the joystick and explained how the lever worked. Ready? He asked. Ready, niece declared with the solemnity of a pilot about to take off. They moved slowly around the large, round table, niece squealing with laughter as David let her control the direction. Other guests started to notice some smiling at the sweet sight, others whispering behind their hands. But David seemed to be focused entirely on niece, pointing out different buttons and explaining their functions. When they completed one loop and came back to Heaven's side, niece was beaming. Mommy, did you see that I drove it? David let me drive. I saw, my love. That was so kind of David to share with you. Niece carefully climbed off and threw her arms around David's neck in a spontaneous hug. Thank you, David. You're the kindest grown-up at this party. David's expression softened and Heaven saw something vulnerable flash across his face before he smiled. You're pretty kind yourself, niece. Heaven sat down in the chair next to David while niece continued to examine the different features of the wheelchair with an unending fascination. Up close, she could see that David was likely in his early 30s with warm brown eyes and dark hair that was perfectly styled despite the evening's activities. His suit looked expensive but not ostentatious, and his hands were strong and well kept. So how do you know Jake and Marie? She asked. Jake and I are business partners, David explained. We started the company together about 7 years ago, and you said you work with Marie at Mercy General Hospital. Marie is one of the best surgical nurses I've ever worked with. She's been like a sister to me ever since I started there 2 years ago. Are you a nurse? David asked. Heaven nodded. The emergency room. And I'm in med school part-time. It's slow going with niece and work, but I'm determined to finish. David's eyebrows rose in respect. That's incredible. Nursing is hard enough on its own, let alone adding med school. How do you manage it all? Lots of coffee and very little sleep, Heaven said with a tired smile. But niece is worth it. I want to be able to give her a better life, and being a doctor will help me do that. Niece had moved to examine the wheels of the wheelchair, her little fingers tracing the spokes. David, why do you need this chair? She asked with the uninhibited directness only a child possesses. Heaven's heart stopped. Niece, that's not polite to ask. It's okay, David said softly. He looked down at niece, who was patiently waiting for his answer. I was in a car accident a few years ago and it hurt my legs. They don't work like they used to, so I use this chair to get around. Does it hurt? Niece asked. Not anymore, David replied. Not most of the time. That's good, niece said matter-of-factly. My mom says when things hurt, it means our bodies are trying to get stronger. Maybe your legs will get stronger too. David's smile was very gentle but also sad. Maybe so, niece. Heaven felt a lump in her throat from the exchange. Niece's innocent optimism and David's patient handling of her questions showed something so beautiful about both of them. Her daughter had never been afraid of differences, but not every adult handled her curiosity with such grace. Niece, can you come sit down so David and I can talk? Heaven asked. Niece climbed into the chair next to David, swinging her feet because they didn't touch the floor. "When do we get to have cake? I saw them cutting it and it looks yummy." "Right now," David said. "Would you like me to get us some?" "I can go," Heaven offered, starting to stand up. "Please," David said, his voice holding something she couldn't quite place. "Let me. I don't often get the chance to do little things for other people anymore." Heaven sat back down somehow, understanding that this was important to him. "That's wonderful, thank you." As David maneuvered his chair toward the dessert table, Niece watched him with clear admiration. "Mommy, I like David," she declared. "He's nice and he talks to me like I'm a real person. He seems very nice." Heaven agreed, watching David navigate the crowd skillfully. A few people moved aside for him, but she noticed very few actually acknowledged him with eye contact or conversation. "Will we see him again after tonight?" Niece asked. Heaven's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't thought that far ahead. The evening had started as a desperate attempt to avoid sitting alone at a wedding where she knew almost no one, but it was turning into something more complex, something that made her feel both hopeful and nervous. "I don't know, my love. We'll just have to see." But as she watched David return with 3 plates of cake, carefully balancing them while maneuvering his chair through the crowd, Heaven found herself starting to hope the answer would be yes. David returned to the table with 3 beautifully plated slices of wedding cake. Each was carefully held on a small tray he had requested from the staff. The cake was a magnificent 3-tiered creation with vanilla buttercream and fresh strawberries, and Niece's eyes lit up at the sight of it. "That looks amazing," Heaven said, taking her plate with gratitude. "Thank you so much for getting this for us." "Thank you, David," Niece echoed, already digging into her slice with the kind of enthusiasm only a 5-year-old can muster. David felt a strange, warm sensation spread through his chest as he watched them enjoy the cake. When was the last time he had done something as simple as fetching dessert for companions? When was the last time someone thanked him for such a small gesture with such genuine appreciation? "So tell me about your company," Heaven said, taking a delicate bite of her cake. "What kind of business are you in?" "We develop medical technology," David explained. "Specifically devices that help people with mobility challenges live more independently. Prosthetics, adaptive equipment, smart home systems, things like that." Heaven's eyes widened with interest. "That's incredible. So you're helping people improve their lives every day." "We're trying," David said modestly. "It started as a personal interest after my accident. I was frustrated with how clunky and outdated most of the adaptive equipment was. So Jake and I decided to see if we could do better." "That's so wonderful." Heaven's voice was full of genuine admiration. "You took something difficult that happened to you and turned it into a way to help others. That takes real strength." David's cheeks flushed. He wasn't used to people seeing his work as inspiring rather than just business. "Jake handles most of the engineering. I'm in charge of the business side of things." "David," Niece said abruptly, cake smeared at the corner of her mouth, "do you make legs for people who don't have legs?" "Niece," Heaven said softly. "It's okay," David said. "That's a very good question." He looked down at Niece, who was waiting patiently. "We do work on prosthetics. We're developing a new kind of leg that can be controlled with your thoughts, kind of like how you think about moving your real leg." Niece's fork stopped in midair. "You can think a fake leg to move." "Well, it's complicated, but kind of," David explained. "The brain sends signals to the muscles, and we figured out how to pick up on some of those signals and turn them into motion for the prosthetic limb." "That's like magic," Niece whispered. David laughed, a real deep laugh that came from his chest. Sometimes it feels like magic. Science can be pretty amazing. Niece loves science, Heaven said proudly. She's always asking me how everything works, and I have to look up half the answers. What's your favorite kind of science, niece? David asked. Niece thought very seriously as she chewed her cake. I like animals and how they work and how birds fly and fish breathe underwater and why cats always land on their feet. Those are all great things to be curious about, David said. Did you know that engineers study animals all the time to figure out how to build better machines? Like studying birds to make better airplanes or studying dolphins to make better submarines. Really? Niece's eyes were wide. Really? It's called biomimicry. Bio means life and mimicry means copying. So biomimicry means copying life to create technology. Heaven watched this exchange with growing wonder. David was talking to Niece as if she were capable of understanding complex concepts, yet he was explaining them in ways a 5-year-old mind could grasp. As a single mother, she was used to carrying the entire burden of enriching Niece's curious mind on her own. Having someone else share that burden, even for just one evening, felt like a gift. The band shifted to a more upbeat song, and several children ran out to the dance floor, including some around Niece's age. "Mommy, can I go dance?" Niece asked. Heaven glanced at the dance floor, calculating the distance and potential hazards as she always did. "Stay where I can see you, and if any grown-ups try to talk to you, you come right back here, okay?" "Okay," Niece agreed, already starting to climb out of her chair. She stopped and looked at David. "Do you want to dance with me?" David's expression became carefully neutral. "I don't dance anymore, niece. But you go have fun and we'll watch you." "But you can still dance," Niece said with the flawless logic of a 5-year-old. "Your chair can move and spin, that's dancing." Before David could reply, Niece was off toward the dance floor, her blue dress swirling behind her like water. Heaven saw the flicker of longing on David's face before he could hide it. "She's right, you know," she said quietly. "Dancing doesn't have to look like everyone else's dancing. I used to love to dance," David confessed, watching Niece happily twirl among the other children. "Rebecca and I, my ex-fiancée, used to go dancing every Friday night. There was this little jazz club downtown with a live band and a tiny dance floor. We were probably terrible, but we didn't care." "What happened with her?" Heaven asked softly. David was silent for so long that Heaven thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "She couldn't handle the new reality. I don't blame her. Our whole future changed in one night, and she was 26 years old. She had every right to want the life she was originally meant to have." "Did you love her?" Heaven asked. "I thought I did," David said. "But looking back, I think I loved the idea of her, of the life we had planned together. I'm not sure I ever really knew who she was beyond those plans." David paused, then looked straight at Heaven. "What about Niece's father?" Heaven's jaw tightened a little. "He left when Niece was 6 months old, said he wasn't ready to be a dad, that he felt trapped. I haven't heard from him since." "That's his loss," David said simply. "That's what I tell her when she asks about him. She's starting to notice that other kids have dads, and I know it's only going to get harder to explain as she gets older." "Let me tell you something," David said. "You're doing an incredible job with her. She's smart, curious, polite, brave, all the things that matter." Heaven felt a sudden sting of tears. "Thank you. That means more than you know. Some days I feel like I'm failing at everything." "I doubt that's true." They watched Niece on the dance floor, twirling and laughing with the other children. Niece saw them watching and waved enthusiastically, almost tripping over her own feet. "She's so brave," David commented. "Sometimes too brave," Heaven said with a mother's anxiety. She talks to everyone, asks a million questions, assumes everyone wants to be her friend. I worry the world will extinguish that optimism in her. Or maybe she'll change the world, David offered. Maybe people like Nice are what the world needs more of. Heaven looked at him thoughtfully. Is that what you're trying to do with your company, change the world? I'm trying to change small pieces of it, David said. One adaptive device at a time, one person's independence at a time. It's not world-changing, but it matters to the people we help. I think that's exactly what changing the world is, Heaven said firmly. You're giving people their lives back. David felt something shift inside him, like a door unlocking after years of being bolted shut. Here was this incredible woman, a dedicated mother who saw him as a person of purpose, someone who was contributing something valuable to the world. When was the last time anyone had looked at him that way? Nice came running back to the table, out of breath and radiant with happiness. Did you see me dance, Mommy? I did spins and hops. We saw everything, Heaven assured her daughter. You were wonderful. David, Nice said, are you sure you don't want to try dancing? I can teach you some moves. David looked at Nice's hopeful face, then at Heaven's encouraging smile. For the first time in 5 years, he felt brave enough to try something that terrified him. You know what, Nice, maybe just for one song. The dance floor felt different when David viewed it from his wheelchair. The music seemed louder down here, the bass thrumming in his chest and the lights more brilliant, casting colorful patterns on the polished marble. Nice had appointed herself the dance instructor, demonstrating various moves with the seriousness of a seasoned choreographer. Okay, first you do this, she said, holding her arms up high and swaying back and forth. This is called the tree dance because you move like the branches in the wind. David held his arms up and mimicked her swaying motion, gently rocking his wheelchair from side to side. Several other guests had noticed their unusual dance, but instead of stares or whispers, he saw smiles and nods of approval. Perfect, Nice declared. Now try the spinny move. David executed a smooth spin in his wheelchair, and Nice clapped with glee. You're a really good dancer, David. I have a good teacher, he replied, completely sincere. Heaven approached them on the dance floor, moving to the music. She wore her confidence like her most beautiful accessory, her red dress swirling around her as she danced. When she reached them, she held out a hand to Nice. May I cut in? She asked with a mischievous smile. Mommy, you have to watch David's spinny move, Nice said, but she took her mother's hand and started dancing with her. David watched the two of them, a perfect unit in motion. Heaven's love for Nice was evident in every glance, every protective gesture, every word of encouragement. But what struck him most was Heaven's natural inclusion of him into their circle, never making him feel like an outsider or a burden. The song changed to a slower number, and the couples around them moved closer together. Nice immediately adapted, taking slower, more deliberate steps. This is the princess dance, she announced. You have to move like you're wearing a fancy dress. David couldn't help but chuckle at her logic, but he slowed his movements to match hers anyway. Heaven caught his eye over Nice's head and smiled, and David felt that same warm sensation in his chest he'd been experiencing all evening. When the song ended, Nice was ready for a break. They made their way back to the table together, and David was surprised to find himself feeling energized rather than self-conscious after his time on the dance floor. That was wonderful, Heaven said as they sat back down. Thank you for dancing with us. Thank you for asking me, David replied. Honestly, I didn't think I'd ever dance again. Why not? Nice asked, as direct as ever. I guess I was worried people would stare, or that I wouldn't be able to keep up, or that I'd look silly, David said. Niece considered this with the same seriousness she applied to all important matters. "But everybody looks silly when they dance," she said finally. "That's what makes it fun." David and Heaven exchanged a look of amusement and admiration for the wisdom of a 5-year-old. "She's right," Heaven said. "Some of the best dancing I've ever seen looked absolutely ridiculous." "Tell me about the silliest dance you ever did," David said, genuinely curious. Heaven's cheeks went a little pink. "Oh, goodness. When I was in nursing school, my roommate and I used to have study breaks where we would put on music and just dance around our tiny apartment to de-stress. One night we were so tired and delirious we spent an hour doing interpretive dances to medical terms. I had a whole number for gastroenteritis." "That is truly horrifying," David said. David laughed so hard he had to wipe a tear from his eye. "I would pay money to see that dance. You would not," Heaven protested, but she was laughing too. "What's gastroenteritis?" Niece asked. "It's a fancy way of saying a tummy ache," Heaven explained. "Can you dance it for me?" "Absolutely not," Heaven said with finality, but her eyes twinkled with mirth. David felt himself experiencing something entirely new. This easy laughter, this comfortable conversation, this feeling of being included and appreciated for who he was. Now not who he used to be or who he might become. It was like he had been holding his breath for years and could finally exhale. "What about you?" Heaven asked him. "What's the silliest thing you ever did?" David thought for a moment. "In college, Jake and I entered a dance-off at a club near campus. We had no business being there, but we were convinced we could win the $100 prize. We practiced for weeks learning this complicated hip-hop routine. We were terrible, but we were so confident." "Did you win?" Niece asked. "We came in dead last," David admitted. "But we had so much fun that we didn't care. We kept going back to that club every weekend just to dance badly and laugh about it." "I wish I could have seen that," Heaven said wistfully. "Jake probably still has the video somewhere," David said. "We made his girlfriend film it because we thought we were going to be famous." They fell into a comfortable rhythm of conversation for another hour, sharing stories and discovering mutual interests. David learned that Heaven loved old movies and made the best chocolate chip cookies in her apartment complex. Heaven learned that David played the piano and had a secret addiction to reality television shows that he watched while working late at night. Niece contributed her own observations and questions, keeping them both entertained with her unique perspective on the world. She was captivated by David's descriptions of his work and asked if she could come to his office to see the thinking legs he was developing. "If your mom agrees, I would be happy to give you a tour," David said, looking at Heaven. "We have a demonstration lab where people can try out different devices and see how they work. It's actually pretty kid-friendly." Heaven hesitated for a moment, the protective instinct she had honed as a single mother making her weigh the offer carefully. But then she saw the hope in David's eyes and the excitement on Niece's face, and she realized she didn't want this evening to be the only time they spent together. "That sounds educational and fun," she said. "If you're serious about that offer, Niece would love it." "I'm absolutely serious," David assured her. "Are you free next Saturday?" "We usually go to the park in the morning and then grocery shopping," Heaven said. "It's pretty thrilling." "The park sounds wonderful too," David said. "Would you mind if I came along?" Niece bounced in her seat. "Mommy, can he come to our park?" "Please, Heaven." Looked at David, this man who had somehow transformed an awkward wedding reception into one of the most enjoyable evenings she'd had in years. "Are you sure you want to spend a Saturday morning chasing a 5-year-old around a playground?" David's smile was the most genuine expression she had seen from him all night. "I can't think of anything I'd rather do more." As the wedding reception began to wind down, Heaven realized that this unexpected evening had changed something fundamental in her world. For 2 years, she had been singularly focused on Nice, her studies, and her work. She believed there was no room in her life for anything else. But sitting here with David, watching him interact with her daughter with such patience and kindness, she began to wonder if there might be room for more after all. David's phone had been ringing non-stop for 3 days, and each call brought worse news than the last. He sat in his office on Tuesday morning staring at the financial reports spread across his desk as his assistant Laura delivered the latest developments. Morrison Industries just made another offer to Tech Med Solutions, Laura said, her voice tight with stress. 20% over market value plus a guaranteed employment package for all their current staff. David rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. Tech Med Solutions was Rodriguez and Associates' largest client, representing nearly 30% of their annual revenue. Losing them would be a massive blow, and the offer Morrison Industries had made was almost impossible to refuse. "What's our counteroffer?" David asked, even though he already knew the answer. "We can't match it," Laura said softly. "Morrison has deeper pockets than we do, and they're clearly willing to take a loss on this partnership just to hurt us." David's jaw clenched. Morrison Industries was a massive conglomerate that specialized in acquiring smaller competitors and either absorbing them or shutting them down completely. They had been circling Rodriguez and Associates for 2 years, making increasingly aggressive moves to sabotage David's business. "Set up a meeting with TechMed's board of directors for Thursday," David said. "I want to present our case in person." "David," Laura said hesitantly, "maybe it's time to consider Morrison's buyout offer. The terms aren't terrible, and you'd walk away with enough money to—" "To do what?" David interrupted. "Retire at 32 and spend the rest of my life living with the regret of giving up on everything Jake and I built." Laura was silent for a moment. David knew she was thinking about practical things like employee salaries, health insurance, and the dozens of other companies that depended on Rodriguez and Associates for contracts and partnerships. "I'm not giving up," David said with finality. "Not yet." But as Laura left the office and David turned back to the financial projections, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. 43 people worked for Rodriguez and Associates. They had mortgages, car payments, and college funds that depended on David making the right decisions. Jake had trusted him to handle the business side of things. And now David was facing the very real possibility of losing everything they had built together. His phone buzzed with a text message from Heaven. "Niece drew you a picture of Harold the Duck. Can't wait to show you tonight." David smiled despite his stress. Tonight was Wednesday, which meant he would be helping Niece with her homework and having a quiet study session with Heaven. It was the only bright spot in what was shaping up to be a terrible week. But as the afternoon wore on, the crisis deepened. TechMed's CEO called to personally inform David that they would be making a final decision on Friday morning. 2 other clients called to express their concern about Rodriguez and Associates' financial stability, hinting that they might need to reevaluate their partnerships if the company's future was uncertain. By 5 p.m., David was running on coffee and stress alone, and he realized with a sinking heart that he would have to cancel on Heaven and Nice. There was simply too much to do. Too many calls to make, too many last-ditch strategies to explore. He called Heaven, hoping to catch her before she left work. "Hi," she said, her voice warm and cheerful. "I was just thinking about you. Niece has been talking about showing you her duck drawing all day." "Heaven, I'm so sorry," David said. I have to cancel tonight. There's a crisis at the company and I need to... Oh. The disappointment in her voice was palpable even though she tried to hide it. Is everything okay? It's complicated, business stuff. I might lose a major client and I have to work late to try to save the partnership. Of course, Heaven said quickly. Work has to come first. Niece will understand. But David could hear the hurt beneath her words and his chest tightened with guilt. He had promised to be reliable, to be present, and he had broken that promise at the first sign of trouble. I'll make it up to you both this weekend, he said. Maybe we can go to that butterfly garden Niece was talking about. That sounds nice, Heaven said, but her enthusiasm was forced. Good luck with everything tonight. After she hung up, David sat in his empty office feeling like he was failing at everything that mattered. The business crisis was threatening his livelihood and that of everyone who worked for him. And now he had let down the two people who were becoming the most important part of his life. He ordered Chinese food for delivery and braced himself for a long night of strategic planning and financial forecasting. But every time his phone buzzed with another piece of bad news. He thought about the excited look on Niece's face when she talked about showing him her drawing and about Heaven's quiet disappointment when he canceled their evening. By Thursday morning, David looked like he hadn't slept in weeks because he hadn't. The meeting with TechMed's board was scheduled for 2 p.m., and David had spent all morning preparing a presentation outlining every possible reason why they should stay with Rodriguez and Associates rather than accept Morrison's generous offer. The meeting went better than David had dared to hope. TechMed's board was impressed with his passion and his detailed plan for future growth. But in the end, business was business and Morrison's offer was simply too good to refuse. We're so sorry, David, TechMed's CEO said as the meeting ended. We truly have enjoyed our partnership and we wish you all the best, but we have to consider our shareholders and Morrison's terms are just too favorable to turn down. David shook hands with each board member and maintained his professional facade until he was alone in the elevator. Then he closed his eyes and let himself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Losing TechMed didn't mean Rodriguez and Associates would go out of business immediately, but it did mean layoffs. It meant cuts to salaries and benefits. It meant having to tell Jake's wife that the company they had built together was struggling to survive. It meant having to admit to all of his employees who depended on him that he had failed to protect their jobs. David's phone buzzed with a text message from Niece sent from Heaven's phone. Hi, David. I hope your work meeting goes well. Love, Niece. The simple message with the spelling mistakes of a 5-year-old and the unconditional support almost broke David completely. Here was this little girl who believed he could do anything and he was letting her down along with everyone else. David went back to his office and closed the door before the tears could fall. For 5 years, he had built his identity around being successful, being in control, being the man who could solve any problem with enough determination and strategic thinking. But this problem was bigger than his determination. And for the first time since his accident, David felt truly helpless. His assistant knocked on the door. David, Morrison Industries just called. They want to set up a meeting to discuss their buyout offer. David looked at his reflection in the dark office window. Maybe Laura was right. Maybe it was time to accept reality and take Morrison's money. Maybe it was better to surrender with dignity than to keep fighting a battle he couldn't win. But as he reached for the phone to call Morrison Industries, David thought about Niece's drawing of Harold the duck waiting at home to be shared with him. He thought about Heaven studying for her medical degree at her kitchen table while he helped Niece with her reading. He thought about the life they were building together and how badly he wanted to be a man worthy of it. David put the phone down. He wasn't ready to give up. Not on his company and not on the future he was just beginning to imagine with Heaven and Niece. But he also wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting without losing everything that mattered most. David hadn't answered his phone in 2 days. Heaven had tried calling on Thursday night after Niece went to bed and again on Friday morning before she left for work, but both calls went straight to voicemail. Her text messages received terse, apologetic responses that he was dealing with a work crisis, but offered no details or timeline for when things would get better. By Friday night, Heaven was worried enough to take matters into her own hands. She had Niece's overnight bag packed by 6 p.m. "Where are we going, Mommy?" Niece asked, watching Heaven pack snacks and juice boxes. "We're going to visit David," Heaven said. "I think he might need a little cheering up." "Is David sad?" Niece asked with immediate concern. "I think he might be having a hard time with something at work, and sometimes when people are having a hard time, they forget to eat dinner or take care of themselves." Niece nodded seriously. "Like when you were sick last month and you forgot to eat your lunch." "Exactly," Heaven said. "Just like that." Heaven had gotten David's address from a business card he had given her weeks ago, though she had never been to his apartment. She wasn't even sure he'd be home, but she had a feeling that if David was struggling, he was probably doing it alone in whatever expensive penthouse he called home. The building was just as impressive as she had expected. There was a doorman, marble floors, and a quiet elegance that screamed of serious wealth. Heaven suddenly felt self-conscious in her casual jeans and Niece's backpack decorated with cartoon characters. "Good evening," the doorman said politely. "May I help you?" "We're here to see David Ole," Heaven said. "I'm not sure he's expecting us." The doorman called up to David's apartment and Heaven held her breath waiting for the response. "Mr. Ole says you can go up," the doorman said with a smile. "32nd floor apartment 3201. The elevator ride seemed to take forever, with Niece bouncing with excitement and asking questions about whether David's apartment overlooked the park or if they could see their own building from his window. David opened the door looking like he hadn't slept or shaved in days. His hair was a mess, he was wearing wrinkled clothes he looked to have slept in, and his eyes had the hollowed-out look of someone under extreme stress. "Heaven," he said, his voice raw with surprise and something that might have been relief. "Niece, what are you guys doing here?" "We brought you dinner," Niece announced, holding up the takeout bag Heaven had bought on the way over. "And I brought my Harold picture to show you." David's expression softened as he looked down at Niece's earnest face. "You brought me dinner. Mommy says you might forget to eat when you have work troubles," Niece explained matter-of-factly. "Like when she gets too busy with her homework and forgets her lunch." "Can we come in?" Heaven asked softly, "if you're not too busy." David stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. Heaven had expected opulence, but she hadn't expected the apartment to feel so cold and soulless. The furniture was beautiful, but it looked like it had been chosen by a designer, not by a person who actually lived there. The walls were mostly bare except for a few expensive-looking abstract paintings, and there were no personal touches she could see. "It's so big in here," Niece said, her voice echoing slightly in the large living room. "Do you really live here all by yourself?" "I do," David said, and Heaven heard a note of loneliness in his voice that made her chest ache. "Don't you get scared?" Niece asked. "I would be scared in a big place like this. Sometimes I get a little lonely," David admitted. Niece nodded in a way that was full of empathy and took his hand. "But we're here now, so you don't have to be lonely tonight." David looked down at Niece's small hand in his, and Heaven saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. "Let me go warm this up," Heaven said, taking charge. "Niece, you show David your drawing while I find the kitchen." The kitchen was enormous and looked like it had never been used for actual cooking. Heaven found expensive appliances that still had the plastic wrap on some of their surfaces and a refrigerator that contained only bottled water, condiments, and a few leftover takeout containers. While she heated up the Chinese food they had brought, she could hear David and Niece in the living room. Niece was explaining her drawing in detail, describing Harold's personality and how the duck liked to swim in circles in the pond. "He's very smart," Niece said. "Smarter than Penelope because he figured out that if he swims closer to the edge, people can give him bread more easily." "That is smart," David agreed. "Animals often know things we don't expect." "David!" Niece said, her voice taking on the serious tone she used for important conversations. "Are you having trouble at work?" There was a pause, and then David said softly, "Yes, Niece. I'm having trouble at work." "What kind of trouble?" "It's complicated, but basically some people want to take over my company. And if that happens, a lot of the people who work for me might lose their jobs." "That's not fair," Niece said with a 5-year-old's indignation. "Can't you just say no to them?" "I'm trying, but sometimes in business the people with the most money get to make the decisions." "That's a stupid rule," Niece declared. Despite his stress, David laughed. "It is a stupid rule." Heaven called them to dinner and they sat around David's formal dining room table eating takeout Chinese food from paper boxes. The sight was absurd in such an elegant space, but it also felt right, as if they were bringing warmth and life to a place that had been waiting for a family to fill it. "David," Heaven said as they shared the sweet and sour chicken, "tell me what's really going on. Maybe talking about it will help." So David told them about Morrison Industries and the takeover attempt, about losing TechMed Solutions. He explained about the employees who depended on him, about the legacy he shared with Jake, and about the impossible choice between fighting a losing battle and surrendering everything he had tried to build. "The smart business decision would probably be to accept Morrison's offer," David concluded. "I'd walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else, and my employees would probably keep their jobs under Morrison's management." "But you don't want to do that," Heaven observed. "I don't want to give up, but I also don't want to bring everyone down with me if I'm wrong about being able to fight back." Niece had been listening to this conversation with the same concentration she gave to everything she found important. Now she put her fork down and looked at David seriously. "David," she said, "do you remember what you told me about the third little pig?" David looked confused. "About the third little pig? You said I would be a good one to play her because I'm smart enough to trick any wolf." "I did." "You're smart too," Niece said with conviction. "And these Morrison people sound like wolves trying to blow down your house. But you built your house with bricks, didn't you? With the thinking legs and helping people and all that important stuff." David stared at Niece, and Heaven saw something shift in his expression. "You're right," he said slowly. "I did build it with bricks. So don't let the wolves blow it down," Niece said matter-of-factly. "That's what the smart pig would do." After dinner, Niece settled on David's sofa with her coloring book while Heaven and David cleaned up the kitchen together. "She's right," Heaven said as she washed the dishes, "about not letting the wolves win. It's not that simple, Heaven. This isn't a fairy tale." "No, it's not. But Niece is still right about the important part. You've built something that matters. You're helping people live better lives. That's worth fighting for." David leaned against the kitchen counter, watching Heaven move efficiently in his pristine kitchen as if she belonged there. "What if I fight and lose everything? What if I make things worse for all the people who depend on me? What if you don't fight and spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you'd just tried?" David was silent for a long time. Then he said, "There's something else I'm worried about. If I keep fighting and the company fails, I'll lose everything. The apartment, the financial stability, all of it." I won't be able to take you guys to fancy restaurants or give Nice the experiences I could have. I'll just be a guy in a wheelchair with a failed business and a lot of debt." Heaven stopped and turned to face him. "David Ole, are you seriously thinking that Nice and I care about your money? I don't think you do. I just want to be able to provide for you both." "Look around this apartment," Heaven said with conviction. "It's beautiful and expensive and utterly empty of the things that truly matter. Do you know what Nice said to me in the elevator on the way up here?" David shook his head. "She said, 'Mommy, I hope David's apartment has pictures of people he loves like we do.' She was disappointed there weren't any." David looked around his living room as if seeing it for the first time. "I never put up pictures because I didn't have anyone I wanted to see every day. But I do now," Heaven said. She moved closer to him, close enough to take his hand. "David, I fell in love with you the moment you went onto that dance floor in your wheelchair and taught my daughter that dancing wasn't about how you moved, but about moving with joy. Nice fell in love with you when you took her questions seriously and treated her like a person who was worth listening to. None of that had anything to do with your financial portfolio." "You fell in love with me?" David asked softly. Heaven's cheeks were flushed, but she didn't look away. "Yes, I did, completely and irrevocably and with no regard for your financial portfolio." David reached up and gently touched her face. "I fell in love with you too, both of you. You've changed everything for me, Heaven. Before you and Nice, I was just existing. Now I'm living." "Then don't give up on the life you're building," Heaven said. "Fight for your company, fight for your employees, fight for the work that gives your life meaning, and let Nice and me fight beside you." Before David could reply, Nice appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Are you guys done with your work talk?" she asked. "Because I found David's TV and it's super big and I think maybe we could watch a movie together." Heaven and David looked at each other and smiled. "That sounds perfect," David said. "What do you want to watch?" "A movie with a happy ending," Nice said with finality. "I like stories where the good guys win." As they sat on David's sofa with Nice curled between them, David felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a man clinging to a sinking ship, but the solid hope of a man who was no longer fighting alone. Tomorrow he would call Morrison Industries and tell them he wasn't interested in their buyout offer. He would find new clients to replace TechMed Solutions. He would fight for his company, his employees, and the work that gave him meaning. But tonight he would watch a movie with a happy ending with Nice's head on his shoulder and Heaven's hand in his. And remember that the most important battles are the ones worth fighting. 6 months later, David stood on the rooftop terrace of his office building looking out at the New York skyline. The spring breeze swept through his hair, carrying the scents of grass and life. But the sense of difference didn't come from the wind or the sun. It came from inside, from a place that 6 months ago had been only emptiness. Rodriguez and Associates had not only survived the assault from Morrison Industries, but had thrived in ways David had never anticipated. After that night when Heaven and Nice had come knocking, he had called Morrison and flatly refused their buyout offer. He had explained it to them calmly, his voice filled with a self-assurance and sense of purpose. He had long since lost. He knew he couldn't fight them head-on, but he also couldn't back down. He had chosen a different path, a path of creativity and courage. After losing TechMed Solutions, David had been forced to think unconventionally. He reached out to smaller companies, nonprofits, and international partners who shared his vision to make adaptive technology more accessible to everyone. The breakthrough came when a documentary filmmaker approached David about creating a film about his company's work. The documentary, titled Building Bridges, Technology and Hope, aired on a major network and brought Rodriguez and Associates more attention and new partnerships than David could have ever imagined. "We don't just sell devices," David explained in the film. "We sell independence. We sell the ability to dream big regardless of physical limitations. We sell hope." The film led to a partnership with a major foundation which provided funding for adaptive devices in underserved communities. Rodriguez and Associates had doubled its workforce, opened a second research facility, and launched a scholarship program for disabled students who wanted to pursue careers in engineering and technology. But the most significant change in David's life wasn't professional. It was personal, and it was standing right beside him at that moment in jeans and a leather jacket, looking out at the city and smiling. "I still can't believe how much has changed," he said. "It's only been 6 months and sometimes I feel like my old life belonged to someone else." "That's because it does," Heaven said, taking his hand. "You're not just existing anymore. You're living David." Heaven had completed her first year of medical school with flying colors, balancing her studies with her hospital work and her role as Nice's mother. But now David was helping her with the balancing act. He had moved out of his sterile penthouse, which he had sold with a quickness that surprised him, and into a home with a yard in Brooklyn. A house with rooms that were filled with family photos, laughter, and all the warmth his life had been missing. Nice was now accustomed to David being a regular part of her daily life. Wednesday evenings had become homework nights, with David helping Nice with her reading while Heaven studied her medical texts at the kitchen table. Nice had decided that David was a great reader because he could do different voices for all the characters and never lost patience when she struggled with a difficult word. "Sound it out, Nice," David would say gently. "What's that word start with? Buh," Nice would say, pointing to the word butterfly with her small finger. "And what sound does a bee make on buh?" Nice would say, then sound out the rest of the word until she triumphantly declared, "Butterfly perfect. You're getting so fast at that." Heaven would look up from her textbook to see Nice beaming with pride at David's praise. And her heart would do the little flutter that was becoming more familiar every day. Saturdays had become adventure days. David had taken them to the Science Museum, where Nice had spent 3 hours exploring the hands-on exhibits while David patiently answered her never-ending questions about everything from dinosaur bones to space exploration. He had shown them his office building, giving Nice a tour of the research lab and letting her try out some of the adaptive devices they were developing. "This is so cool," Nice had declared, maneuvering a practice wheelchair around the lab with David's guidance. "It's like driving a car." "Exactly," David had agreed. "Some people need cars for their legs." The lab technicians had been charmed by Nice's enthusiasm and had shown her some of the computerized prosthetics they were working on. Nice had been fascinated by a robotic hand that could pick up objects and spent 20 minutes making it wave at her. "We're helping people do all the things they want to," David had explained. "Just like your mom helps sick people get better at the hospital. So you and Mommy both have helping people jobs?" Nice had said with a satisfied nod. "We do," David had agreed. "We both have helping people jobs." Sundays had become cooking days. David had confessed that he lived almost exclusively on takeout and frozen dinners, so Heaven had taken it upon herself to teach him some basic recipes. Nice had appointed herself the sous chef and took her responsibilities very seriously. "David, you have to stir the sauce clockwise," Nice instructed from her perch on the kitchen counter. "That's how Mommy does it." "Clockwise," David said solemnly, adjusting his stirring technique. "Why does the direction matter?" he asked Heaven in a low voice. "It doesn't," Heaven whispered back with a smile. "But Nice thinks it does, so we go with it." It was these mundane, everyday moments that surprised David the most. He had always imagined that a family life would feel restrictive, full of obligations and schedules and compromises. Instead, he found himself looking forward to Wednesday nights and weekend adventures more than any business meeting or social event he had ever attended. One Saturday afternoon, as they sat in Riverside Park watching Niece feed the ducks with approved duck food, Heaven brought up a topic that had been on her mind. "David," she said carefully, "Niece has been asking me some questions." "What kind of questions?" "About whether you're going to stay in our lives, about whether you might be her daddy one day." David felt his chest tighten. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that caring about someone doesn't come with guarantees, but that you care about both of us very much, and that's what's important for now." "That's a good answer," David said, watching Niece toss breadcrumbs to Harold the mallard. "Is it accurate?" Heaven asked quietly. David turned to look at her directly. "The caring part is absolutely accurate. I care about you and Niece more than I knew was possible. The staying part." "Heaven, I want to stay. I want to be a part of your lives in whatever way you'll have me. But I also want to be realistic about what that means. I'm a complicated person. My life isn't simple. There are things about my condition that might affect Niece as she gets older." "What things?" David paused, choosing his words carefully. "Kids can be cruel about differences. If Niece tells a classmate that her boyfriend or stepfather is in a wheelchair, there might be comments or difficult questions for a kid to handle." Heaven felt a flash of protective anger. "Then those kids need to be better raised and educated." "I agree, but that doesn't make it any easier for Niece if it happens." "David, look at me." He met her eyes, and he saw a vulnerability there that made him want to hold him tight. "Niece has been different her whole life," Heaven said with conviction. "She's the only kid in her class being raised by a single mom. She's one of only 3 kids of color in her school. She's never had a father, and other kids have already asked her about that. Different isn't a new concept for Niece. This isn't the same thing." "You're right. It's not the same thing. It's better. Niece would be proud to talk about you. Do you know what she told her teacher when Mrs. Patterson asked her what she did over the weekend?" David shook his head. "She said, 'I went to the science museum with my mom and David knows all about how animals help people invent things.' She then spent 10 minutes explaining biomimicry to the entire class." David felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "She doesn't see your wheelchair as something to be ashamed of," Heaven continued. "She sees it as part of what makes you interesting, and to be honest, so do I." Niece came running toward them, having fed all the ducks to her satisfaction. "Harold ate the most," she reported, "but Penelope got some too, so it's fair." "That was very thoughtful of you to make sure all the ducks were fed," David said. Niece climbed onto the bench next to David and leaned into his arm with the natural affection that had grown between them over the last several weeks. "David," she asked, "are you going to come to my school play next month?" "You have a school play?" David asked with interest. "What's it about?" "We're doing the 3 little pigs, and I'm the 3rd little pig, the smart one who builds her house out of bricks." "Perfect casting," David said. "Seriously, you're definitely smart enough to outsmart any wolf." "So are you coming? Mommy's coming, and Grandma Johnson is coming, and I want you to come too." David looked at Heaven, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," David said. "I'll be in the front row cheering on the smartest little pig in the whole play." Niece beamed and snuggled closer to David. "This was the best park day ever," she declared, as they walked home from the park with Niece skipping ahead and pointing out interesting flowers, dogs, and cloud shapes. Heaven felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. For 3 years, she had been the sole architect of their small family's happiness. Now, all of a sudden, she had a partner in that endeavor, someone who celebrated Nice's triumphs and worried about her challenges and wanted to be there for all the ordinary moments that made up their life. That evening, as David read Nice her bedtime story, Heaven stood in the doorway and allowed herself to imagine a future where this wasn't temporary, where David's voice reading fairy tales was a permanent soundtrack to their evenings, where his laughter in their kitchen and his presence at Nice's school events and his gentle encouragement of Nice's dreams were just a part of their regular everyday life. For the first time since Nice's father had left heaven, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do it all alone anymore. 6 months later, David stood in the very same ballroom where he had first met Heaven in Nice. But everything was different now. The light of the autumn afternoon streamed through the tall windows, casting golden patterns on the floor, where couples had danced during that magical spring evening. Today, that same floor would witness a different kind of magic. Rodriguez and Associates had not only survived the assault from Morrison Industries, but had thrived in ways David had never anticipated. After losing Tech Med Solutions, David was forced to think more creatively about how to grow his company. He reached out to smaller companies, nonprofits, and international partners who shared his vision of making adaptive technology more accessible to everyone who needed it. The breakthrough came when a documentary filmmaker approached David about creating a film about his company's work. The documentary, titled Building Bridges, Technology and Hope, aired on a major network and brought Rodriguez and Associates more attention and new partnerships than David could have ever imagined. "We don't just sell devices," David had explained in the film. "We sell independence. We sell the ability to dream big regardless of physical limitations. We sell hope." The film led to a partnership with a major foundation that provided funding for adaptive devices in underserved communities. Rodriguez and Associates had doubled its workforce, opened a second research facility, and launched a scholarship program for disabled students who wanted to pursue careers in engineering and technology. But the most significant change in David's life wasn't professional. It was personal, and it was standing at the altar wearing a stunning cream-colored dress, holding a bouquet of red roses and smiling at him as if he were the most wonderful thing she had ever seen. Heaven had completed her first year of medical school with top marks, balancing her studies with her hospital work and her role as Nice's mother. But now David had helped her with the balancing act. He had moved out of his sterile penthouse and into a house with a yard in Brooklyn where Nice could play, where the rooms were filled with family photos, laughter, and all the warmth his life had been missing. Nice stood beside Heaven as the honorary maid of honor, wearing a vibrant blue dress and holding a small bouquet that matched her mother's. She had insisted on being a part of the ceremony rather than just watching from the audience. "I want to help you get married to Mommy," she had explained to David with a 5-year-old's logic. "Making a new family is important work." David had worked with the wedding planner to create a ceremony that included Nice as an active participant. When the officiant asked if there were any objections to the union, Nice would step forward with a series of special vows that David and Heaven had written together. The small room was filled with the people who mattered. David's employees who had become an extended family over the past months. Heaven's colleagues from the hospital. Nice's teachers and classmates, and even Jake, his best friend who had flown in from Colorado to witness David marry the woman who had brought him back to life. As the ceremony began, David felt the same nervous excitement he had experienced 6 months ago when he decided to fight for his company instead of giving up. This was another leap of faith, another decision to choose hope over fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today to witness the union of David Ole and Heaven Johnson, and to welcome Niece Johnson into their new family. Niece beamed at the mention of her name and waved to the audience, causing the wedding guests to chuckle. The ceremony proceeded with the traditional vows between David and Heaven, a recitation of words about love, commitment, and facing life's challenges together. But when the officiant reached the part about objections, Niece stepped forward as planned. "Excuse me," she said in a 5-year-old's clear voice. "I have some important things to say." The officiant smiled and nodded. "Go ahead, Niece." Niece turned to face David, her small face serious with the weight of responsibility. "David," she said, "I have to tell you some things before you marry my mommy." David leaned forward in his wheelchair, giving Niece his full attention. "First, you have to promise you'll always read me bedtime stories even when I'm too big for them." "I promise," David said solemnly. "Second, you have to promise you'll come to all my school plays and my science fairs and my other important things." "I promise." Third, you have to promise to take care of my mommy when she's sick or sad or too busy with her homework to remember to eat her lunch. "I promise to take good care of your mommy." "And last," Niece said, her voice growing quiet, "you have to promise you'll be my real daddy, not just a pretend one." David felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was not a part of the planned ceremony. Niece had added it all on her own. "Niece," he said, his voice thick with tears, "I promise to be your real daddy forever and ever." Niece wrapped her arms around David's neck in a fierce hug, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. When she pulled back, Niece turned to her mother with the same serious demeanor. "Mommy, you have to promise some things too." "What do I need to promise, my love?" "You have to promise to let David help you with things, even when you think you should do everything all by yourself." Heaven laughed through her tears. "I promise to let David help me." "And you have to promise to make him chocolate chip cookies when he has a bad day at work." "I promise to make lots of chocolate chip cookies." "And you have to promise to love David even when his wheelchair gets stuck in the door or when people are mean to him." "Niece," Heaven said, her voice breaking with emotion, "I promise to love David no matter what forever and ever." Niece nodded with satisfaction and moved back to her spot beside her mother. "Now you can kiss and get married," she announced to the officiant. The formal ceremony ended with David and Heaven's first kiss as husband and wife, and with Niece jumping up and down, clapping with pure joy. At the reception afterward, David sat at the head table watching Niece dance with anyone who would join her, her blue dress swirling as she twirled on the floor. Heaven sat beside him, her hand in his. They were both in awe of how perfectly the day had gone. "Mrs. Ole," David said, trying out his new wife's name. "I like the sound of that," Heaven said, leaning down to kiss him on the cheek. "Daddy David," Niece called from the dance floor where she was teaching David's assistant Laura how to do her signature spinny move. "Come dance with me." David looked at Heaven, who smiled and nodded. "Go dance with your daughter," she said. "I'll be right here when you get back." As David moved toward the dance floor, he reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he was a lonely man who had given up on the possibility of a family. He had defined himself by his limitations and his losses, believing that his accident had put an end to his chances for true happiness. But Niece had looked past his wheelchair to see the person inside. Heaven had seen his potential for love and connection. Together they had shown him that family wasn't about perfect circumstances or problems disappearing. It was about choosing to be there for one another day in and day out in all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that made up a life. "Are you happy, Daddy?" Niece asked David as they danced together, her small hands guiding his wheelchair in gentle circles. "I'm the happiest man in the world," David said, and he was completely sincere. "Good," Niece said with satisfaction. "Because we're a real family now, and real families are supposed to be happy." As the reception wound down and the last guests left, David, Heaven, and Niece stood together in the very same spot where David had sat alone just months before, feeling invisible and forgotten. Now he was surrounded by love, a part of a family that saw him not as a man who was broken or limited, but as the exact person they needed him to be. "Ready to go home?" Heaven asked, picking up her bouquet and Niece's small purse. "Ready," David said, taking Niece's hand in one of his, and reaching for Heaven's hand with the other. As they walked toward their car, Niece swinging their joined hands between them. David thought about fairy tales and happy endings. He had learned that true happy endings weren't about perfect circumstances or problems disappearing. They were about finding the people who loved you enough to face whatever came next together. David Ole had found his people. He had found his family. He had found his happy ending. And it was only the beginning. And that's the story of David, a story not about miracles or magical healing, but about finding the light when you thought you were in the dark. David didn't find a way out of his wheelchair, but he found a reason to live, to love, to fight a reason named Heaven and Niece. This story shows us that happiness isn't the absence of problems, but about finding people who are willing to face every problem with you. David found his family, and they helped him realize that a person's value isn't defined by what they've lost, but by what they can give and the people they love. So what about you? Have you ever found your own light in an unexpected moment? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring story. See you soon.